It is Retail Fest this week, and I hope that I get around to recording episode 90. Welcome back, everyone. It is episode 89 of This Week in E-commerce as we close in on the magic 100 number, which is not too far away now. I'm recording this on Monday, the 26th of May, which is, like I said before, Retail Fest week. So I'm super excited for the week of celebrations, networking, and learning that's ahead. There's some really great events, including a few dinners, some cocktail parties, and more. Unfortunately, I won't be around to relive my glory years at Q Melbourne with John Course DJing on the Friday night party, but c'est la vie. However, there is a bit more of an important note to start off this with, which is that today is National Sorry Day. Now, this is a day which has pretty important significance for Australia, as it should. And it's an opportunity for us to reflect on the history and the impact of the stolen generations from many, many decades ago. Now, that is a very horrific time in the history of this nation. And I think it's a really important one to make sure that we do acknowledge, because like Winston Churchill said, if we don't learn from the mistakes of history, we're doomed to repeat them. And this is what one of these is. And when I was speaking to a colleague of mine in Singapore the other week, she was talking about Welcome to Country and how this day isn't something, or how Welcome to Country isn't something which is really practiced anywhere else. And it took her by surprise that in a lot of the countries, whether they be in Europe or in England or in the United States, they don't really acknowledge some of the atrocities which have been done onto the Indigenous people. So the fact that Australia does that is quite remarkable. And I think that's something which we should be proud of as a country and we should learn to build on as well. And so I just wanted to make sure that we do acknowledge National Sorry Day as this opportunity to really reflect on our shared history and what this means for us so that we can continue to do better moving into the future. So some of those things are looking for ways which we as businesses can continue to partner with Indigenous communities, looking to see how we can support Indigenous owned brands, as well as providing opportunities for employment and leadership for Indigenous peoples. So I really hope that this isn't just lip service for a lot of people, but we actually do look at this as an opportunity for real change. All right, moving into our first story, and we do have three really big stories for today, and more of a global scale, not really going to be focusing too much on the local this week, because our first one is going to be about Trump and the tariffs again. After you thought that everything was kind of settling down there, it seems that this guy cannot get enough of tariffs. It's his favorite word, as he often says. And this time he has put Apple in his crosshairs with a threat that there will be a 25% tariff on iPhones which aren't manufactured in the US. So again, continuing to put more and more pressure on Apple to onshore production. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. Apple, who have been famously reliant on China for a lot of their manufacturing for the iPhone, have been investigating how to move it to India. That's not good enough for Trump. And he said, India are doing fine. They don't need the business. America does. So he's really pushing for iPhones and more to be manufactured in America, which is just, let's face it, really, really bloody difficult because of the cost of labor and also the technological requirements necessary, which America just doesn't have. And also, America also doesn't want factory jobs. If you look around, there's actually a lot of jobs available in factories in America which are left vacant because no one is applying for those jobs. Now, if this goes through, there's going to be a significant increase in the cost of iPhones. I think the latest predictions are about $3,500 for an iPhone in America, which is obviously quite gigantic, given that we only pay about $1,600 Australian here for our iPhones. Now, this caused Apple shares to tumble by about 3.7%, which took their valuation below $3 trillion, which it hadn't been for quite some time. So quite a lot of impacts from this with the market and investors being really spooked by this and what this could potentially mean. Now, Apple is not alone in this because Donald Trump has also recently criticized Walmart for not absorbing the cost of the tariffs. In his words, he feels that Walmart, Target, and other companies should be eating the tariffs which have been imposed on them. Clearly, this is a guy who doesn't understand how business is done because businesses pass on those tariffs, those costs to the consumer. That's what's normally done. But obviously, he has a fear of this happening because his people are going to feel the impacts of this, as the cost of the goods they're buying to get about their daily lives would go up dramatically by this. In the case of Walmart, it's particularly interesting because Walmart operates on a high volume, low margin business. They have already done a lot of those negotiations to make sure that the price is as low as possible. And they set up these gigantic stores with lots and lots of inventory to sell huge volumes of these products. So they're already operating on super thin margins. And to think they can just easily eat those tariffs and those margins and not pass it on to the consumer is just patently ridiculous. So we're seeing that with all this pressure which is being put on private companies, you no longer have this separation of church and state, which, let's face it, in America doesn't really exist anymore as religious beliefs and religious doctrines start making its way into politics. But the separation of state and business also continues to erode as well, as you have one person and one government which is exerting ridiculous pressure onto businesses to comply and operate in a certain way. Now, to me, this just speaks of working not just in a nanny state, but really working in a bit of a communist kind of environment, a socialist environment where we're picking winners. And the government is now saying, this is the company we're going to work with, and this is how they're going to do things, and really forcing a way of working on there, which is just completely at odds with how the private sector needs to operate to thrive. And what capitalism, which, let's face it, is what countries like the United States and Australia have been built on, have been able to grow, and how our private companies like the likes of Apple, IBM, but also in Australia, a Canva or an Atlassian has been able to grow into a global behemoth. So the immediate impacts for Australia is that this could be further disruption in supply chains, potentially putting more upstream pressure, but also seeing some secondary price effects as well. If these prices have to increase in America, they're likely to increase here too. So we're going to see that our goods will be increasing. So moving on to what this could potentially mean then is that for Australia, this is now extended into the fact that a report was that the interest rate cut from last week was partially driven by the fact that the RBA had confidence that the flood of Chinese-made goods, low-cost Chinese-made goods into Australia would offset some of the cost of living pressures which we've been feeling over the last few years, with the likes of Taobao and JD.com recently launching in Australia to go along with Shein and Temu, who have just started shipping from here. And we're seeing this because all those goods which can no longer go into America because of the tariffs, the 145% tariffs, the 245, now 50% thereabouts tariff, still meaning that those goods are still very expensive to bring into America. Those suppliers who had previously been shipping into there are now directing them elsewhere. And Australia is one of those markets, as we talked about before. And we are definitely seeing the impact of this now with two big Chinese behemoths, Taobao and JD.com, starting to sell their ultra cheap imports into Australia. And this is part of the rationale of why the RBA made those cuts. So they're viewing this, the fact that lower cost imports can help offset some of the margin pressure so that consumers will be able to continue to buy those things and knickknacks which they need. But they haven't factored in what the impact is for the retail sector, which is you listening here, that by encouraging more of these imports, cheap imports, it puts more pressure on Australian retailers who are maybe manufacturing here, but are certainly importing into here to compete. And some of them are now competing against their suppliers, which is just absolutely insane. So in this environment, it becomes more and more important that if you cannot compete on price, you have to compete on other measures. You need to be thinking about your brand positioning. You need to be thinking about your quality. You need to be thinking about your aftermarket service, which you're offering, to figure out how are you going to be able to add value in this environment? Because it's certainly not a case of being able to compete on price if your supplier is now selling into Australia as well. But also considering the fact that can you actually provide better logistics? And chances are, if you are fulfilling onshore, you will continue to be able to do so. So think about that. Make sure you're really thinking about your category and how you're actually able to continue to differentiate yourself in market, not just from your domestic competitors, but your international competitors now as well. Because while these tariffs remain in place, these Chinese factories are going to be sending more and more goods into here. More and more of those retailers are going to be selling into Australia. And we just cannot ignore that right now. And we need to make sure that we are nimble, but also making sure that we are figuring out how we can differentiate ourselves in market and provide even better value for our customers. And moving on to our next story, which is about the return of Google Glass. Sorry, not Google Glass, but Google are now re-entering the wearables space. Now, a lot of you may remember the Google Glass experiment from 2013 when that happened. I remember I was watching with great interest around this because I actually thought they were kind of cool. And I had the opportunity to try some of the Google Glasses on at a conference I was at with Avinash Kaushik. It was a really great experience and I thought it was a kind of cool, but they were extremely bulky, very awkwardly designed. And well, let's face it, they were also pretty fugly as well. And at the time, because of the technology, the use cases were fairly limited in what was actually possible in that. So when they first launched the Google Glass in 2013, they really tried to take this mainstream. They were trying to sell this commercially, but unfortunately they pulled the pin on it, I believe in about 2015 or so, after they realized that they weren't able to get any sort of traction. And really the market for wearables was fairly nascent, if not non-existent at the time, because people hadn't really figured out how to make these things a utility and useful in their day-to-day lives. That is until the Apple Watch came along. So when the Apple Watch came along, that had completely reinvented the wearables market. And suddenly there was a really strong use case for wearable technology. Now, people had tried wearables for a long, long time, but the Apple Watch was the first time where you had this device which really became an extension of your phone, and you were able to use that in so many different ways, whether it be taking a photo, playing music, answering calls, but also tracking your heart rate and other health indicators. So really revolutionizing that, and then bringing that to the AirPods as well. AirPods, a fantastic device. I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I'm onto my fourth pair of AirPods because I've lost 3 in the last couple of years. Not a cheap exercise, so I highly recommend figuring out a way to not lose them as much as I do. But the AirPods really becoming a mainstay, and not just being a headphone, but really being a wearable device with what it can do in terms of the noise cancellation, the speech, but also taking directions as well and instruction from you, to now the Meta Ray-Bans, which have become a super hot product. And obviously Meta are investing a lot in this at the moment. During the Milan Fashion Week, they had models on the catwalk wearing them. When I was in Sydney recently for MetaFest, they were doing a lot about them. And there was obviously the great Super Bowl ad with Chris Pratt and Chris Hemsworth, which was a fantastic ad. That whole series always cracks me up and definitely made me want to buy some, which I have to do. But it really has shown how far wearables have come in the last 12 years, where we're now at this intersection of not just the technology, but the utility and the fashion alignment as well, to show that this is now a category where there is going to be a lot of growth. And that's where this story comes in, because Google are now re-entering that space as well. They're going to be partnering with Warby Parker, one of the original D2C darlings in this space, and the South Korean eyewear brand Gentle Monster. They partnered with them with a $150 million investment to design new AR and AI glasses, which will incorporate with the Android XR platform. So not much known about this at the moment, but it will provide, I guess, a lot of the similar functionality which the Ray-Ban Metas provide, in that there'll be messaging, navigation, real-time translation, and integration with Gemini AI. So this is a really cool space. I'm very excited about the Ray-Ban Meta glasses as soon as I can get mine. But also with with Google entering this space as well, you can see how this is going to continue to develop as well, with more and more of these AI glasses out there. So it's clear that with this investment, consumer adoption is really at a point now where a lot more people are feeling comfortable to invest in this, unlike the metaverse. And the price point is also starting to come down as well, with the glasses generally starting to be fairly affordable, about the $300 mark. And while there is sort of a privacy pushback and it is still kind of seen as a niche product, as the form factor becomes more and more refined and fashionable and integrated with just your day-to-day look, which I think the Meta Ray-Bans do quite well, you're going to start to see them becoming more widely adopted, which is going to raise the issue around privacy and people being able to take content without the other person knowing or the other person consenting. So it's still fairly early days in terms of what's possible and where this is going with this space, but it's really one to start keeping an eye on as well, particularly knowing Android and how open that platform is, what opportunities there are to start incorporating them into your own customer experience as well to provide a broader omni-channel experience for any retail tech vendors. The ability potentially to be able to look at a product and get a price for that or see where that's going to be available, for instance. But also for retailers, understanding how is that data going to be consumed. So particularly when I was testing out the Meta Ray-Bans, being able to look at a building or a piece of art or a record and ask it questions about that. Where is it finding that information from? And how do you ensure, similar to Gen AI search, that your content could potentially be used in that? So when the AI, whether it be Llama or Gemini, is researching it, it's finding information about your brand and it can surface that for the user to hopefully connect with your brand and buy from you. So still a long way away to figure out what this is, but really something which with this investment really shows that it's a space which retailers should be starting to look into. Obviously, don't bet the farm on it. There's plenty of other things you need to worry about for the moment, but still really starting to think about how this is going to evolve and what this potentially means for you as a retailer, but also for your customers as well, and where this is going to fit in their space. So a super quick episode as we get ready for Retail Fest. I'm going to have a lot more to talk about next week with Retail Fest as we experience everything there is up there. So in the meantime, though, I want to leave everyone with just thinking about the time which we're in right now. We are approaching the mid-mark of the year. We're in May, about to enter June, only 1 month left. So hopefully you know what your end of financial year sale is, if you're going to be doing one at all, or whatever you're going to be doing in this opportunity. Because as we get into the back half of the year, it's all about preparing for peak. So keep innovating, keep selling, and keep growing. And we'll be back next week on This Week in E-commerce.